Welcome to this special broadcast of the 1960s. With me tonight is Tabby and Larry. Let's go to Tabby with the recap of the Kennedy's administration.
Thank you, Taylor. To start off the decade, John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon competed against each other for the 1960 presidential election. On September 26, the two candidates participated in the first ever televised debate. 70 million people tuned in to the broadcast. Kennedy had been coached by producers so that he would then look and speak better than Nixon. This did the trick.
After Kennedy was elected for president, the Broadway show came out, which was called Camelot. The Camelot was one of the best Broadway shows in 1960. John F. Kennedy's wife loved this show, and JFK's daughter and son loved to listen to this record before bed.
Camelot was a very good show, and one of the best. In March of 1960, Eisenhower gave the CIA permission to secretly train the Cuban exile for an invasion on Cuba. The CIA was hoping it would trigger a mass uprising that would overthrow Castro, who is the leader of Cuba. Kennedy approved of it, and on the night of April 17, 1961, around 1,500 Cuban exiles supported the U.S. military. They landed on the island's southern coast of Bahia de Cochinos, which is the Bay of Pigs.
With the Bay of Pigs, nothing went as planned. An airstrike had failed to knock out the Cuban Air Force. Kennedy negotiated with Castro for the release of surviving commandos and paid a ransom of $53 million in food and medical supplies.
In the summer of 1962, Soviets said that they would help Cuba out and defend them. The flow to Cuba and Soviet weapons, including the nuclear missiles, increased greatly. Kennedy responded with a warning that America would not tolerate offensive nuclear weapons in Cuba.
Kennedy informed the Cubans that if there was any missile attack from Cuba, would trigger an all-out attack on Soviet Union. For the next couple of days, the world faced terrifying possibilities of a nuclear war. The Soviet Union was on its way to Cuba and had many nuclear weapons, and at the same time, the U.S. was preparing for war. In Florida, there were about 100,000 troops. This was the largest invasion that has ever happened.
In 1961, Kennedy had his Ich bin ein Berliner speech. This speech was given in West Berlin. This speech means I am a Berliner. It was a big speech because it also talked about the Berlin Wall, which was a concrete wall topped with barbed wire that covered the city in two.
While Kennedy was president, he also created the Peace Corps. It was a program of volunteer assistance to developing nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. People in the U.S. called it this Kennedy's Kitty Corps, because many volunteers were just out of college and not mature enough. While in the years to come, Peace Corps became very successful. Everybody was signing up to work as cultural advisors, teachers, and health aides. The Peace Corps ran through the 1960s because by 1968, more than 35,000 volunteers had served in 60 nations around the world.
On April 12, 1961, the Soviets had sent the first human in space. Kennedy thought it was a challenge, so decided that America would send a man to the moon and surprise the Soviets. A couple months after that happened, we created NASA, which is National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Kennedy spoke in front of Houston and expressed the spirit of the space race.
In 1969, the United States achieved its goal with having Neil Armstrong take its first steps on the moon. That was very exciting for the United States. With that being exciting, there was bad news in 1963. Let's go to Larry to see what the news was.
Thanks, Tabby. On November 22, 1963, the Air Force One, which was the president's aircraft, landed in Dallas, Texas. Kennedy and his wife came to Texas for political reasons. Kennedy and his wife sat in the back of an open-air limousine. In front of them were Texas Governor John Kennedy and his wife. Kennedy yelled back to Kennedy and said, "You can't say that in Dallas. It isn't friendly to you today."
After that, Kennedy got shot in the head. The doctors tried to do everything, but they were too late. That was a sad day for everybody, and everybody remembers that day like it was yesterday.
After Kennedy's assassination, the world grieved for days. The historical broadcast was televised nationally. Everyone stopped what they were doing.
Johnson was then sworn into office. After making few comments about Kennedy's death, Johnson went to Congress with a very hopeful domestic legislative package. Part of this package was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It banned discrimination based on race, religion, origin, and gender.
Later in 1964, the race between Johnson and Republican Barry Goldwater was on. By this time, many Americans were harmonizing with Johnson and agreed that the government should help solve U.S. problems. Goldwater scared Americans with the threat of using nuclear weapons and saying the complete opposite of everything Johnson said and did.
Johnson won the election by a landslide and went on with the ideas which referred to the Great Society. He provided over $1 billion for schools across the country to enhance the education. He then established Medicare and Medicaid for elderly and for those on welfare. Next, he built affordable housing and established the Department of Housing and Urban Development.
But that's not all. He also opened America's door for all immigrants with the Immigration Act of 1965. Then Johnson helped the environment with cleaning up all bad chemicals and pesticides in the rivers and surrounding areas. Last but not least, he made Congress pass huge safety laws regarding food and consumer items. All items had to have truthful labels and packaging, as well as in cars and tires too.
The Great Society is sounding better and better for some. It kept going. Chief Justice Earl Warren led the Warren Court and took an activist point of view while passing laws in the Supreme Court. They banned public prayer and oaths in schools, limited communities the power to censor items such as books and movies, and overall granted more free speech everywhere. The thing they really got into, though, was the issue of redraw elections based on the number of people in each state, or as it's known better as reapportionment.
Reappointment. Yes, Warren Court is very busy with all the crimes and stuff, but what about that was war. Kennedy was planning on backing out, but then Johnson goes in and sends planes to attack northern Vietnam after the USS Maddox returned fire on patrol boats. He kept this all a secret from Congress and the rest of America until then he went through with Operation Rolling Thunder to bomb North Vietnam.
Involvement increases greatly in Vietnam. However, as the war drags on, more Americans don't want to support any longer. But soldiers were needed, and so a draft was held. In 1965, many Americans are fed up with the war and start protesting VC. This divided the U.S. into the Doves, anti-war, and the Hawks, pro-war. Johnson was determined until chaos started erupting in Congress and soon across the entire U.S.
In 1968, Johnson decided to step down, leaving the presidential race wide open to anyone. After Robert Kennedy was shot and killed, the race was left to Eugene McCarthy against Herbert Humphrey, Johnson's VP for the Democratic Party, and Republican Richard Nixon. Nixon's triumphs started to pull out troops from Vietnam. This takes much time and effort, but on March 29, 1973, the last of the U.S. troops leave for home. The war has ended.
Volcano. Alive. Camaro. Fiery new creation from Chevrolet. Camaro, the new car that's something else, something you've never seen before in a driving machine. This is the SS350 with rally sport equipment, wicked flat grills, and a fuselage that bulges around a 350 cubic inch V8 engine. Shaped for action, all the way back to its sporty rear deck.
In the 1960s, there were the civil rights with Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and don't forget Malcolm X.
You're right, Tabby. There was a lot of things going on, but let's start off with the Brown v. Board of Education. This was when the father of Linda Brown had charged the Board of Education of Topeka by violating Linda's rights by denying her admission to an all-white school. This made the Supreme Court struck down segregation in schooling as an unconstitutional violation.
That was an upsetting story for the Brown.
That was an upsetting story for the Brown family, but let's not forget about Little Rock 9. There were 9 brave African-American students to integrate Little Rock Central High School as the first step to this plan they had.
A judge ordered for someone from the school to let them in. The teachers ordered the students to take 8 and 9 students to school. They couldn't reach the other student because she didn't have a phone, so she had to walk. Eisenhower finally acted and placed the Arkansas National Guard under federal control.
There was also the Montgomery bus boycott. At the first, the bus drivers made the blacks sit in the back of the bus. Someone sent a letter to the Alabama asking to have the bus drivers not make the blacks sit in the back seat. The mayor refused to pass the law, but 18 months later, a woman named Rosa Parks made a difference. She took a seat on the bus right in front. She refused to move. This is how the bus boycott started.
With that in mind, Rosa Parks is important in the 1960s, and another person that everybody liked was Martin Luther King Jr. He was elected the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He was only 26 years old. Martin Luther King Jr. was a great pastor, and he was very moving in his speeches.
With all the happening, we also had the Martin Luther King speech at the Lincoln Memorial Center. This speech was, "I have a dream." People were so upset when he died because of the speech that he gave at the Lincoln Memorial. It was very moving, and everybody got something out of it.
Martin Luther King Jr. was a good man, but just like JFK, he was assassinated. On April 3rd, 1968, he was in Memphis on his hotel balcony after a big speech he gave. A gunshot went off.
A gunshot went off, and King fell to the ground. Everybody was in shock, just like JFK's death. But on a good note, we also have a good speaker who is Malcolm X. He was a very positive and upbeat. He knew how to get a crowd going.
In 1964 and 1968, there were two civil rights acts. The one in 64 prohibited discrimination because of race, religion, national origin, and gender. It gave all citizens the right to enter libraries, parks, washrooms, restaurants, theaters, and other public areas.
The Civil Rights Act of 1968 ended discrimination in housing. After school segregation ended, the number of African Americans who finished high school and who went to college increased significantly. This in turn led to better jobs and business opportunities.
There were plenty of movements in the courts during the Civil Rights Movement. There was the March to Washington, which had 250,000 people in the protest. There was the Birmingham protest. These people protested to have equality. The last one was the Freedom Riders, which had hoped to provoke a violent reaction that would convince the administration to pass this law.
On August 2nd, 1964, a North Vietnamese patrol boat fired a torpedo at an American destroyer, the USS Maddox. The missile missed, and then the Maddox destroyed the patrol boat. The Tonkin Resolution on August 7th was not a declaration of war. It granted Johnson board military powers in Vietnam.
General William Westmoreland, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon were important leaders during the Vietnam War.
The U.S. got involved because we don't want the spread of communism, and In the years following 1965, President Johnson sent a large number of troops to help the South Vietnamese.
There was a lot of protest from the younger generation. This became known as the New Left. There was a lot of protesting from college campuses. Two new groups formed known as the Doves, people who were strongly against war, and then there were the Hawks, who were completely for the war.
Offense included the Viet Cong Vietnamese militia group.
Militia group.
Militia.
Viet Cong opened fire on over 100 cities as well as 12 U.S. air bases. And they even attacked U.S. Embassy.
25 Americans. This continued for about a month until the South Vietnamese and the U.S. troops regained control. The impact on the 1968 election. There was a bloody riot between the Democrats and the police, which led in a lead for the Republican candidate, and this election Nixon won.
Newly elected President Nixon announced the beginning of the withdrawal from Vietnam. The pullout began in 1969. In the end, 58,000 were killed and 303,000 were injured. In Vietnam, the death toll was over 2 million.
Hey, how about a nice Hawaiian punch? Sure. Hawaiian punch. Wasn't that a refreshing commercial?
John F. Kennedy went into Congress with a new plan to provide medical care, rebuild areas, and education. Advance national defense, increase international aid, and expand the space program. He called his plan the New Frontier and called Americans to be new pioneers to advance in all of these areas, especially in space and science.
Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, was launched in 1957. By the Soviet Union, it traveled at tremendous speed around the world. This was a huge lead for the Soviets that scared the U.S. Americans poured money into the U.S. space program and then 3 months later launched their own satellite. This was after the fact that it failed the first time humiliatingly.
April 12, 1961 marked a huge triumph for the Soviets and the start of the race to the moon. Yuri A. Gagarin became the first human in space. Kennedy saw this as a great challenge. Kennedy's speech about the nation's space effort is very well known.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goals will serve to organize and measure the best of our engineers and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept. One we are willing to postpone, and one which we intend to win, and others too.
Working with NASA to build launch facilities and a mission control center, Kennedy started what is now known as Kennedy's Space Program. It took 9 years, but finally on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong was the first prince on the moon.
In the 1960s, there was the space race, which was when Kennedy was president. Lyndon B. Johnson had a big part in the space race. In 1967 and in 1968, Johnson and other senators were having a controversy over the USSR's launch of the Sputnik, and Eisenhower was forced to send it into space. But with that, it had a good ending because the first person on the moon.
With Johnson being in charge of it, Richard Nixon did have a lot to say. But he just watched the world while Neil Armstrong was the first man to step on the moon. When that happened, Nixon called him and congratulated Armstrong on behalf of everybody by telling him how happy and proud we are.
Well, in the 1960s, we had the aftermath of the Cold War. After the Cold War, the Soviets built the Berlin Wall. In 1961, Berlin was a city in great turmoil. The Soviets realized that they had to do something. Soviet leader threatened to sign a treaty with East Germany that would enable the country to close all access roads to West Berlin. Kennedy refused to give up access to West Berlin. Khrushchev furiously declared that they wanted peace. The 1960s is also a time of many rights movements. The Latino population is now protesting for equal opportunities and respect. They created unions on the farms they worked on and took a stand for what they thought was right. Native Americans were having troubles too. They were having much trouble adapting to suburban life and were among the poorest of the poor. Natives took their old treaties to the government and won the settlements and a lot of money to survive on.
While the minorities are having trouble, women are deciding to take a stand. The belief that women should be economically, politically, and socially equal, or feminism, grows quickly throughout many housewives. Women protested to be equal to men in many different areas, such as the workplace, community, and home. There were some women opposed to such things through and liked being housewives. This started a new right and pro-family movement. Women eventually moved up, but were still lesser in the eyes of many opportunities.
Yes, women are a huge part of our society, but I want to talk about the silent majority. This was a group of mainstream Americans who quietly supported the war still going on in Vietnam. Nixon focused on this group to win this election. With that, I move on to the counterculture. A bunch of college kids getting together to turn away from the system and focus on peace and love. Hippies started to come out in the very colorful clothes and took on many of the Eastern religions such as Buddhism. They also took on rock and roll as well as the frown upon drugs and sexual actions.
The art and music that came out of this was amazing though. Popular art, or pop art, was rising due to the works of Andy Warhol. Paul McCartney, John Lennon, George Harrison, and Richard Starkey, better known as Ringo Starr, took America by storm as the Beatles. They opened the doors wider for the rock and roll industry. A few years after they appeared, the Woodstock Music and Art Festival took place in 1969. For 3 days, 400,000 people camped and watched their most beloved musicians perform, such as Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, the Grateful Dead, and many others.
Many famous TV shows started to turn up too, such as The Dick Van Dyke Show, Beverly Hillbillies, Green Acres, Addams Family, and many others. TV is only about a decade old and still new to many who own them, and it has become a very big part of every American's life and still is to this day. As well as showing all of these entertaining shows, it showed America what was going on overseas and keeping them informed on everything that went on in the other parts of the country and the world.
Thank you for joining us tonight at the broadcast of the Psychedelic 60s. Have a good night, America.